Good morning again, Senate Agriculture. Going to continue on with our day. We're going to talk about the CAFO program. We have with us today the Secretary of Agency of Natural Resources. Good morning, Secretary. How are you?
I'm good. Would you like me to?
Please come on up.
Excellent.
And we are hearing a lot about CAFO. We're hearing a lot of programs that we're trying to familiarize ourselves with. We have just one committee member back that knows a lot of this, and so there's no detail that's too small that we wouldn't be interested in, and the floor is yours.
Great. So good morning. For the record, I'm Julie Moore. I'm the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources. I'm joined this morning by Pete Laflamme, who heads up the Watershed Management Division in the Department of Environmental Conservation, which is one of the 3 departments that are part of the agency. Also expecting our General Counsel, Catherine Gessing, to join us in a few minutes' time to help. That might be her right now to ensure we have everybody here who can help answer questions. So what we thought we would do this morning is sort of give a broad overview of how we find ourselves where we sit today. And so as you may have heard in the news, there is a lot of conversation around a CAFO program, a concentrated animal feeding operation program that would be administered by ANR. This is a different approach than we currently are using to regulate farms in Vermont. And so thought that this background and context could be helpful for that conversation, knowing that we will need to bring forward a set of changes to Title 10, so the environment statute, which will come into Senate Natural Resources in all likelihood, but speak to changes that are needed for us to be able to meet address some of the deficiencies EPA has identified in our current program.
We probably, Secretary, again, we are new. And so if you could tell us a little bit, go backwards a little bit maybe, and tell us what CAFO is and what it means and what it doesn't mean and all that, it would be very, very helpful to us.
So I'll start, and then I'm actually going to turn things over to Pete so he can help with the expertise. But the genesis of this conversation was in 2022, the Conservation Law Foundation filed what is called a de-delegation petition. And so essentially they wrote to EPA and said, EPA, we don't believe the state of Vermont is fulfilling all of the obligations they have under the Clean Water Act. In particular, they are focused on concentrated animal feeding operations. And they asked EPA to review the information they had compiled, to participate in an independent review of our programs, and then either agree with the petition or come back to us with a set of recommendations and identify necessary changes that we need to implement in order for them to essentially dismiss the petition. So
I'm sorry, Secretary Moore, who made the petition?
The Conservation Law Foundation.
Okay.
So it's I think a citizen suit provision under the Clean Water Act.
Okay.
Is that accurate, Catherine?
Yeah, they didn't file with court, they filed with EPA. And the reason why they filed with EPA is because EPA administers the Clean Water Act, and Vermont is a delegated state, and in particular, ANR is the delegated entity that's supposed to implement the Clean Water Act. So they filed with EPA along with the Vermont Natural Resources Council and the Lake Champlain Committee. So,
And if just wonder, how were they alerted? How did they come to this conclusion? What was their genesis to bring this petition?
So I would say there's been a going concern in the environmental interest community about this bifurcation of how we regulate farms between the Ag Agency and the Agency of Natural Resources. This dates back to a previous petition that the Conservation Law Foundation had filed with EPA in 20 2013,
It was
2010.
resolved in 2013.
So, yeah, so well before
5
2013.
years before
But
that.
this has been an ongoing issue where they see this split jurisdiction as challenging from their perspective. For context, the way Vermont agricultural water quality permits work is they say there should be no discharge from a farm. So the ag agency is working with farmers to make sure any waste from their operation ends up in their manure pit and then is appropriately land applied. The permits we issue are discharge permits. That's the connection to the Clean Water Act. And we have not issued any CAFO discharge permits in the state. We issue other kinds of discharge permits to wastewater treatment facilities, for stormwater, but we haven't issued any to farms. And
what does that mean, Secretary, when you say that you haven't issued one, because you just don't see the need of it or whatever, or can you just expand on that a little bit?
sure.
And I apologize for getting in the weeds of
No,
this a
no.
little bit, but we're very, very new. So
Yeah.
and I think that there's gonna be some legislation that's coming down the road that we need to know more.
So, gosh, I'm sorry, Senator Ingalls, I've lost track of the question.
No, I
Yes.
interrupted your thought. So what's the,
Oh.
why wouldn't you have issued a CAFO permit? There's no need for one or a discharge permit?
So that is actually the kind of the nut of the conversation here, which is the ag agency's goal and all of their work is towards this no discharge standard. What CLF alleged and EPA confirmed is there are instances where discharges are being observed on farms. The Clean Water Act makes no allowance for a discharge on a farm without a permit. It doesn't matter if it's corrected in days, weeks, months, or years. If there's a discharge, it needs a discharge permit. So what they came back to us and said is, we've gone out and done inspections. We've gone through all of the records. And what we have seen is that there is evidence, written evidence that discharges have occurred from Vermont farms. And yet, ANR, you have issued no permits.
And just keep your thought. So discharge meaning not necessarily a discharge into a waterway, but a discharge like as simple as liquid running from a feed silo
Yep.
onto the ground.
So it
Or
does,
is it more worried
No,
about getting into the water?
it is worried
Okay.
about it getting into a waterway. So
Okay.
that kind of connection. I mean, we often follow stained grass or other things to try to get those kinds of indications. But yes, it's not just turned out into a field.
Okay,
It needs to have a
that's
connection.
helpful, thank you.
Mr. Chair, and you said it was written, was there any physical evidence as well as like photos and that sent in with it so you could say, okay, we can, okay.
Correct. And so sort of the ag agency, when those discharges are observed, would take steps to start to remediate them. But what EPA is saying is actually, if there's a discharge observed, the farm needs to be regulated as a CAFO, issued a CAFO permit. And then as that CAFO permit sort of runs its course, which is 5 years, the farm can make a case. We've fully fixed what you saw that was problematic and would like to go back to being regulated by the ag agency, or we haven't fixed it. We have to stay with ANR. Hopefully that's not the case. Or we'd rather just stay with ANR because it's regulatory certainty at this point, right? And this moving back and forth obviously presents its own sets of challenges. So EPA came back to us with that feedback, and that may be the right place for me to hand things over to Pete. We received an initial letter from EPA responding to CLF's 2002 petition in September of last year that laid out a set of concerns that they had identified and asked us to address. High level, we then submitted what we called a corrective action plan in early December. So how are we going to rectify the deficiencies that EPA identified in their letter, and just received their feedback on our draft corrective action plan last week. And they've given us, I think, 60 days to respond. So we're sort of in the throes of this. Part of the challenge is we know we need some statutory changes to have the authorities necessary to fully implement on some of the commitments we've made to EPA. And yet we haven't fully settled the matter. And so just want to try to make sure you all have the context for how we got to where we are, where we believe we are headed, so that when we come in and need to talk about changes to Title 10 around agricultural water quality and permitting, you'll have all of this as background and context.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Committee, any questions for the secretary? She's gonna be right here, I'm sure, but.
Yeah.
Everybody good?
So far.
Thank you,
right.
Secretary.
Sorry, did I run over your clothes?
Good morning, Director Wolfland. How are you?
Good morning, Chair Ingles. I'm doing well. How are you?
Good.
Members of the
Thank you
committee.
for coming today.
Well, thank you for having us.
What would you like to tell us?
Well, for the record, my name is Pete Laflamme. I'm Director of the Watershed Management Division at the Vermont DEC, which, as Secretary Moore described, is part of the Agency of Natural Resources, as you know. And I'll just back up a little bit, talk just for a quick moment about the work of the Watershed Management Division.
Thank you.
Our mission is to protect, maintain, and restore the waters of the state. So we have 8 programs within the division that are concerned with monitoring and assessing our waters, and then also regulating discharges to those waters. And those discharges occur through a number of different ways. We have our stormwater program, our wastewater program, and then our small but mighty CAFO program, which right now have 2 folks in it. So we look at watersheds. We manage on a watershed basis, and different watersheds. There are agriculturally dominated watersheds, there are urban watersheds, there are watersheds that are heavily forested. And we, look at the different sources of discharge and regulate those as necessary. We are a delegated state, as Secretary Moore said, so there's a combined matrix of permits that we can issue to regulate discharges, summarized from federal law, summarized from state law. We're a delegated state. We were delegated in 1974 to issue permits in place of the federal government here in Vermont. 2 of our neighboring states, there are only 4 states in the country left that are not delegated. 2 of them are in New England, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. EPA in Boston issues these Clean Water Act permits. We were delegated in 74 to issue these Clean Water Act permits, and there are a number of Clean Water Act permits that the division does deal with. Secretary Moore mentioned stormwater permits, wastewater permits, pesticide general permit, and then also CAFO permits. So these are all required by the Clean Water Act. They arise from federal regulation, and they're called NPDES, or National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. NPDES permits, you hear NPDES thrown around a lot. So CAFO is a NPDES permit. As Secretary Moore said, it's required to regulate 2 types of discharges on farms. Direct discharges, so a pipe or a ditch, a direct conveyance of pollutant directly to waters of the state, or in certain cases, a non-point source, or discharges from fields when the nutrient management plan is inadequate to control those discharges of pollutants. The primary pollutant of concern is nutrients, phosphorus being key there. Exactly. So, as Secretary Moore said, there's a combined system of.
Can you just, and I apologize.
Oh, no,
I
please
really do.
interrupt.
Hold your thought. I'm not trying to throw you off.
Yeah.
I'm capable of doing that. I apologize. Why would give us an example of a direct discharge? Something that's a pipe that's there.
Pipe
right?
from the production area. So maybe a drain, a drop inlet drain in a production area. If it's a concrete or hard surface production area and water, rain flows across that production area down into that drop inlet, that grate, which then is directly piped out to a stream.
So it's more of a planned design. We have planned for that water to go in that way. We put the pipe there versus an indirect where you just can't.
That's one great example. Another example is if, in a heavy storm, if water comes off of the production area or comes from a silage bunk or overflowing manure pit and carves a channel, an erosive channel down to a river or a stream, a water, or it flows into a ditch, sheet flows into a ditch. So if it passes through at any point between its source and the water, a confined conveyance, a ditch, a pipe, those sorts of things, it would be considered a point source discharge. A non-point source discharge would be more sheet flow or shallow groundwater conveyance directly to a water body.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, and there's always a gray area between those two, as you can imagine. So as Secretary Moore mentioned, on March 16th of 2022, those three environmental groups filed this petition to de-delegate or to take away from Vermont its delegated authority to issue NIPD's permits in general. So not only the CAFO permit, it's all or nothing. They all go or they all stay. So our authority to issue wastewater treatment facility permits or industrial discharge permits or stormwater permits would all go back to Boston if we were de-delegated. They filed that in EPA over the course of 2.5 years between March of 2022 and September of 2024, when they sent a final letter to the agency to Secretary Moore, setting forth deficiencies they found in the program. During that time, they reviewed a lot of records, both at the Agency of Agriculture and at the Agency of Natural Resources. They conducted a number of field visits. They went out on farms and looked at situations there with joint inspections with Ag and with us. And then they participated in this settlement process where, rather than de-delegating, they documented the deficiencies they found and recommended a set of fixes that needed to occur. There were 7 discrete areas that they laid out that Vermont needed to address to prevent, to settle this lawsuit, this de-delegation petition. I believe we provided to Linda the 3 key letters. There really are, I mean, it's a confusing and very complicated, very detailed process, but there are 3 letters in particular that I can hit the high points of. I believe you all have those letters.
They're on the webpage.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you so much. And the first of those letters was the September 9th, 2024 letter from Regional Administrator, the head of EPA Region 1, to Secretary Moore, that set forth over several pages those 7 deficiencies. Essentially, it gets to the fact that EPA delegates to the Agency of Natural Resources the authority to run these permitting programs, but the agency can't in turn subdelegate that authority to anyone else. It's a confusing matrix between state law, Title VI, that governs the 3 types of permits that the Agency of Agriculture issues, the LFO, MFO, and certified small farm permits, all designed to prevent discharges. So that's state law. And that's what we were relying upon. If we issue a permit, if the state of Vermont issues a permit that doesn't allow a discharge, then that would eliminate the need for a discharge permit, a CAFO permit. So that was the logic, the overlay between state law under Title VI and our NIPD's requirements under the Clean Water Act. They found that the agency cannot delegate or subdelegate that authority to look at farms to determine whether or not a discharge is occurring and to do subsequent permitting or compliance action to eliminate those discharges. That ANR needed to be doing that ourselves. So the 7 requirements that EPA required for this corrective action plan to settle this de-delegation petition were that ANR personnel needed to inspect all potentially jurisdictional farms to determine if discharges had occurred or were currently occurring. They needed to review nutrient management plans to ensure their adequacy to prevent non-point source discharges. We need to develop a comprehensive system to track permits, track inspection reports, and track any necessary compliance efforts. We need to take enforcement against farms that are discharging without a permit. And I'll go back to that one in a minute because that's an important point. That we need to have sufficient personnel to be able to adequately implement this program, to be able to get out on farms, do these inspections, issue the permits, inspect the permits, and follow up if necessary, that we need to develop necessary statutory and regulatory authority to be able to fully implement the Clean Water Act requirements. And then finally, that we needed to develop a timeline with milestones adequate to show progress towards doing this. We can't snap our fingers and magically do this overnight. How much time do we need to roll out this comprehensive program of ag management? And how long will that take? What are the milestones showing progress? The point that I wanted to just touch on a bit more is that we need to issue CAFO permits, the federally required permits. Because they're required by the Clean Water Act, and Catherine Gessing can certainly get into much more detail about this from a legal perspective than I, but farms need this permit. And if they discharge without the permit, they're subject to citizen suits. Any citizen can bring a suit against a discharger that's discharging without a federally required permit. It's a provision in the Clean Water Act, and it's a powerful provision. These CAFO permits, these NPDES CAFO permits, act as a shield for a farm that receives the permit to prevent, if they have the permit and they're complying with the terms of the permit, they're protected against citizen suits. The CAFO permit covers storms up to the 25-year storm, which frankly, these days isn't all that much of a storm, and above that, discharges are not prohibited in the CAFO program. So it's sort of the design standard, if you will. So RA Cash sent that letter to Secretary Moore on September 9th and gave us until December 9th to submit a detailed corrective action plan that addressed those 7 points. We did that. We created a corrective action plan, a timeline designed to address those 7 points, and Secretary Moore transmitted that to EPA. That plan, believe me, I won't read through the entire thing, but that plan is provided to you as the second of those 3 letters. Immediately after that, Secretary Moore and Secretary Tebbets from the Agency of Agriculture issued a joint letter to farmers explaining what was going on with all of this. And on December 16th, we also had a public meeting that was also streamed online to answer questions and explain the process. It's a midpoint in the process. We had sent this down to EPA to review. We can certainly.
How many occupants during that public review did you get?
Not many.
Okay.
Not many. We had some technical service providers. We had a few farmers, and that was about it.
Okay.
So not many came.
Always interested in people
yeah.
actually, because you put it out there and then you only get a handful. So,
Right.
But you will get a lot more in a handful when you start saying, hey, you got to start meeting these. Okay.
You're absolutely right. So that.
To your point, and also to yours, of the people who know what, as far as farmers, what's been the feedback?
At that meeting from the technical service providers and from certain farmers, we've actually received positive feedback. One of the benefits, as I was mentioning a few moments ago, of the, obtaining the NPDES permit and having that, as required by the Clean Water Act, does provide, if the farm is complying with the terms of the permit, provides protection against any sort of citizen suit.
So I'm curious too, how many farms were found to be in violation according to this lawsuit?
EPA's inspection, the inspections they did and the data they poured over, there were a number. And I don't have that number, Senator Cullimore, on the tip of my tongue, but I can certainly find out.
I'd be interested.
Yeah.
If it's 1 or 2, to me, that's a lot
More
different
than
than 50.
Yeah, it was between those 2 numbers. Of
Okay.
course, right?
More number, any number.
Yeah.
Did you provide the context of the number of farms that fit into each of those categories, large, medium, and small?
No, I didn't.
So I think that this may help just contextualize. I think there's roughly 30 large farms in Vermont, mostly dairies. at least one egg farm. There's about 150 medium farms. And then the balance of our roughly 600 farms is our small farms. And so when we're talking about our program design, we are really focused on those medium and large farms, so about 180 farms in total. And I think there were at least a couple dozen, and Catherine may have numbers in front of you, but of places where either through direct observation by EPA inspectors or by their review of files provided, they identified conditions that they thought would rise to the level of requirement.
I'd also be curious to know whether there were point source or non-point, how many of each?
Do you want-
Direct.
So I won't be able to give you that information, but if you look at the letter, the first letter that EPA issued, they examined records from February of 2021 to January of 2023. And they were focused mostly on complaints. So there were, out of 113 complaints, they went out and looked at the records, and they also did some inspections and observed direct discharges to surface waters. They didn't divide them into, they were really looking for point source discharges at that point. And then what they said is that they found that of that 113, 26 complaints were unresolved. In other words, nothing happened. And then 51 complaints, or 45%, were conducted as no violation, when in fact there was a violation. And no NIPDES permit was issued. And then finally, about 7% were noticed as violations, but there wasn't, they felt that there wasn't sufficient follow-up in terms of enforcement. So it's in the first letter that they sent us, just
Okay.
kind of a summary of what their findings were. It doesn't give the kind of detail that you're asking for, but it kind of gives you a sense of where they're coming from.
And council, just in case somebody's listening, just please identify yourself.
I'm sorry,
No
Catherine Guessing, for the record, General Counsel.
Thank you very much.
Agency on Natural Resources.
Yes.
So large, medium, but all farms, basically, right? If all farms would be open to this.
That's correct, if there's a discharge.
And as far as the power distribution between all of this, EPA is the end all, they're the boss, there's no question, there's no appeal of them. They are either you get this corrective action plan to their satisfaction or not, or.
Correct,
Right.
they govern the application of the Clean Water Act nationally. They do it through both delegation and direct administration. Most states, as I mentioned, are delegated, and they look over those states that are delegated to ensure that we're administrating the act in the way specified in the Code of Federal Regulations. So there's a lot of detail in there, but
And the relationship between them and Vermont is that, if there wasn't any merit to it, no problem, but they found merit, and so they felt that they needed to bring this action.
that's correct. They look over all of our NPDES delegated programs, our stormwater programs, our wastewater programs, our PGP, our pesticide general permit program, and then also CAFO, and they found the deficiencies in the CAFO program. They audit us on an annual basis, different programs.
Okay. What else?
I'm almost done with my litany here. So then finally, so we sent the corrective action plan down in December. They looked at the correction action plan. They have written us back on January 17th. We're still reviewing that letter, but they found that more detail is needed, more emphasis in certain areas is needed, and then some additional clarification and language that we had provided in the corrective action plan is also needed. We're reviewing that letter right now, beginning to address some of those deficiencies they found, and we have to provide an answer back to them in early March. So that's sort of the timing as we move through this process.
What do you think that this committee is going to see that we're gonna have to make a decision on all of this stuff? Are we just following the lead as far as everyone, or are we gonna see some type of legislation that's gonna come through, from some folks that are coming through? What do you think that we're gonna see?
I think that there will be a legislative initiative that will probably go through the Environment Committee first, but we're working with the Agency of Ag on legislative language. So, and then I think we'll also, Agency of Ag may have some technical corrections that they want this committee to consider. So I think that's probably what's gonna happen. And I'm not sure exactly what the timeline will be, but certainly will be before crossover, maybe a couple of weeks or so.
Right, and just for perspective, the types of changes are definitions that align with the Code of Federal Regulations, which is one of the things EPA has flagged, as well as changes that would grant us some of the same access that the Ag Agency currently has to farms. This may not be the sum total of the changes necessary to fully implement the directives we're receiving from EPA, but these are the sort of the foundational pieces. And I don't know if you don't want to steal your thunder, but kind of our overall plan is to start joint inspections with the Ag Agency effective almost immediately, like this spring. ANR would actually be the lead on those inspections. Historically, it's been 2 inspectors from the Ag Agency. Now we're gonna have 1 from the Ag Agency and 1 from ANR, so that we're the ones making the determination about if there is a discharge at the farm, as opposed to having the Ag Agency refer things to us for further review. And then we will begin the process of permitting any farms where we have determined that there is a discharge. My expectation is we will need to do this probably for 2 field seasons and then ultimately come back to this body with a bigger set of recommendations once we have answers. Frankly, Senator Collmore, to some of the questions you're asking about the number of farms that would require CAFO permit coverage. If it ends up being a very small number, it may be that we will have the authorities we need and the staff we need to do the work. And if it ends up being a very large number, it may require a different set of changes. But at this point, we sort of don't know what we don't know.
You have very accurately captured my next question, Secretary. Will there probably be a request for increased appropriation from ANR?
I anticipate that the governor's budget will include a modest new appropriation for the agency in recognition of the directions we've received from EPA.
And will those be positions that will stay inside the agency, or if the situation gets better, will there not be a need for that going forward?
It's a great question. I'm not sure. They are positions proposed to be at the agency. It will give us sort of the capacity we need for in more inspections than we are currently participating in, and some additional compliance activities, as well as work PPT needs to do to sort of crew up our existing rules and permits with the current CAFO regulations at the federal level. There's also, I anticipate will be resources to help us take advantage of and build off of the very extensive data management system that the Ag Agency has worked really hard to put in place over the last 6 to 8 years. To the extent you haven't heard from them about their data management system, I would encourage you to. It's really a pretty impressive database that they have built. And rather than reinvent that wheel, we've had conversations with agriculture and believe there is a way we could create sort of an ANR plug-in to the data management system they've already built. That gives us the benefit of all of their past records, and then gives them benefit of any observations and field reports that we're filing going forward, so that there is one comprehensive set of information around Vermont farms. So there's a couple different pieces there, but yeah, in order for us to fulfill the commitments we've made to EPA and our corrective action plan. Some additional resources are going to be needed.
I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
That corrective action plan that the Secretary was just describing, extends over 4 years, and it's an attachment to, the letter from, Secretary Moore down to EPA in December. So you'll be able to see all of the detail of the different steps that we're proposing over 4 years as we ramp up. The ability to do the inspections, the ability to issue the permits, and then the ability to inspect and, correct if necessary, those permits that have been issued. So that's part of the whole set of requirements that EPA found were lacking in the way that the program is currently managed in Vermont.
Thank you. So as the EPA pushes this more down toward the farmers, I'll say, what is it looking like? Retention ponds, that sort of way to remediate and fix the problem. And when they start pushing that, because, you know, it might be a practice that's been going on for decades.
Right.
And the farmer doesn't even realize that, hey, I'm in violation of something I've been doing for decades.
Mhm.
Next thing is, okay, you're gonna come in, is there gonna be funding for them? Because it's like, hey, we need you to fix this, and it's on your dime. Is there gonna be a money source for helping them, the farmers, as we bring this to them?
In terms of the practices, some of it would be identification and disconnection of pipes that shouldn't be there. The pipes that might convey stormwater off the production area. Some of it might be right-sizing manure pits in the face of increasing herd sizes and also increasing precipitation to be able to adequately store the manure. Some of it might be reviewing and truing up some nutrient management plans to ensure there's the right balance between animals and land area and soil phosphorus concentrations to assure that attenuation. So those are just a handful of things that we would be looking at. Clean water diversion. So before stormwater, rainwater runs through the production area, diverting it, capturing it as clean stormwater and being able to route it away from the production area so that they're not commingling. As soon as it commingles, then it becomes a source that needs to be managed. It needs to be put back in the pit. You need to do something with it. If you can minimize the volume of that combined water by diverting it when it's still clean water, that's a huge benefit as well. But in terms of funding, there's a combination. NRCS, as you know, puts money on farms to update and to install new practices. The Agency of Agriculture also does a great job in terms of clean water funds and other funds that they have available to be able to help farms and to provide that technical assistance, to have their ag engineers go out on site and make recommendations, and then help to carry that funding forward.
And if I could maybe add on just a little bit there, or shameless plug. Each year, Pete's right, the Clean Water Fund is sort of the primary state vehicle for supporting these types of practices on Vermont farms. There's about $25 million of state general fund, coupled with about $10 million from the capital bill, as well as some other dedicated resources that feds have committed and flow through A&R. So about $50 to $60 million worth of funding each year. I think better than a quarter of that goes into agriculture, and it's closer to a third. We produce a clean water performance report every year. The most recent one just came out last week. And the team that put that report together, I'm sure would love nothing more than to come and talk to you about how those investments are being made. The way we make decisions around how to invest clean water fund dollars is there's a board of 5 secretaries and 4 members of the public that make a set of recommendations to the governor. So those are with him right now as part of his budget bill. But then on the back end, we have this performance report that shows how those dollars are being deployed and the outcomes they are able to produce. And as I say, the 2024 report just dropped last week, and it's a really impressive body of work, and I think would help sort of contextualize the question you're asking.
And then one follow-up.
Yep.
So I've been in violation for 10 years, not realizing it. How long do I have to fix that problem? And when, if I'm doing diligence, getting whatever resources I need to fix it, how long do you give that applicant before, oh, we're gonna have to start fining you? Because I've been, I do excavation, and I've had a couple farmers that have had to go right out and resolve a discharge problem because, one, your agency did a good job of sending a very well-minded man out, person out to look at the repair. And he was very fair that, hey, you got right on it, so there is no need to go any further. But if it takes a while, one, because you can't get the materials in this, how much leeway do you give them?
Typically with an NPDES permit, the fix, the compliance with the permit needs to occur within that 5-year permit term. To be able to issue the permit, you need to be able to state that water quality standards will be met within that 5-year permit term. But then individual schedules vary by the nature of the work. Sometimes it's a relatively easy fix, disconnecting that pipe, blocking that inlet, diverting that flow, as I was talking about earlier. So it varies depending on the extent. Building an entire manure pit or increasing the size of a pit obviously is a much larger undertaking that requires complex engineering and construction, and you're fully aware of all of that. I mean, so it depends on the fix. Yes, Councilor.
If I may, Catherine Guessing again. Two things. One is that enforcement decisions are generally based on a suite of factors. So, history of noncompliance, the severity of the violation, what its impact is on the environment. So it can be very fact and situation specific. When we implement a new program, we're typically not going to enforcement first, right? We're looking to help people, assist people in achieving compliance within a reasonable period of time. And then the other thing that I just wanted to note is that the Agency of Ag in their program has really tried very hard to align their requirements with the federal requirements. So there are, there's a couple of places where it's not perfectly aligned, but most of the standards are aligned. And so, that idea that somebody out there may not be in compliance with the federal regs is probably, you're probably not going to have a lot of people that are in that boat.
Political question. I don't see how it would even impact it here. But do different administrations have different standards as far as their rabidness towards certain things, or is it just pretty much standard all the way? It doesn't matter who's where, what. I mean, this is something that's going to get resolved to the end. It sounds like it's getting there. But do things change?
I think certainly priorities change within administrations. I think the piece in this particular instance is if CLF is not satisfied by EPA's directions to us and our response to those directions, they can file in federal court and turn it over to the courts. So it would quickly move outside of the federal executive branch and into the judicial branch. And I'm hopeful there is broad agreement both with the petitioners. I know there's strong agreement between EPA and ANR. We would like to avoid that outcome. We would like to be able to design the program and implement it.
Do you think this is solvable?
We do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Councilor O'Grady, what do we do? We just wait? Or do you want to talk another time?
Well, you did ask whether or not you're gonna see legislation, and Catherine and the secretary indicated that they will have a proposal, but I believe the advocates are going to have a proposal as well that will be significantly different.
Yeah.
It will, and you've seen this bill before in prior bienniums, it's a bill to move the entire program from the Agency of Agriculture to the Natural Resources. And that's a significant policy decision. That's something for you to decide. And frankly, the EPA response letter, Friday letter, said they want to see legislation, they want to see regulation, they want to see certain things done. A lot of the things that they're saying they want to see done, those are policy decisions too. Those are up to you. Is it solvable? Can you reach a consensus with the petitioners? I do think so. If you don't, I don't know what they do. They file in federal court, but what remedy do they request? Do they request to withdraw the entire NFTs program because of 500 farms? Because it's not every farm.
Right.
It's farms with livestock. And it's farms with livestock that exceed the list really for a medium or large farm. Because the small farm, you can make that determination, right? Whether or not it needs the permit or not. And there aren't that many medium and large farms in the state. There are some more horse farms than you might think. But to me, a political decision to remove the entire program, which is every NFTs permit, because of a subset of 500 farms, I think that's politically, well, you're the policymaker, you have to figure out that you see politically, but that's gonna be difficult.
Yeah, if I could maybe add a couple of things. One is, I would say that the approach Pete's described and is visible in those documents is pretty surgical or tailored. We're trying to address the explicit Clean Water Act concerns EPA has raised. The proposal, and we've seen a draft of what the advocates, I believe, are likely to propose is this wholesale transfer. That goes well beyond what we need to do to meet our Clean Water Act.
They're piling on.
I'm sorry, Sue.
They're piling on a little bit
Well,
probably.
or just, I think they have a larger
Right.
vision for Vermont's future, right? That is, and this was a point of leverage. And I think they had hoped maybe EPA would push us to go bigger. As opposed to, I think we are pretty well aligned with EPA. As Pete indicated, they would like more substance or meat on the bones of our proposal, but also indicated in broad strokes, the proposal seems like it's moving in the right direction. And so there are gonna be questions about this, the entire program. The other piece is, Mike's correct, that the court's lever in a de-delegation proceeding, should it get filed, would be to take our delegated authorities away. I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not limited to agriculture.
Right.
Agriculture, wastewater, and stormwater would all go back to EPA, which would be, I don't think is where we want to find ourselves as a state, having that regulated out of Boston. That said, it would be a really significant occurrence. I don't believe EPA has de-delegated any previous state, but also just would flag there's always risk when we turn these things over to the courts. And I feel strongly our best approach is to try to resolve it between us and EPA, and then to the extent possible satisfy.
And whatever issues anybody wants to talk about after, they're gonna keep on coming anyways. Yes.
So CAFO, that is definitely in your realm. The ag department has so when we look at this, it knows that it has to go through natural resources. That
we are the delegated authority to issue a CAFO permit. In many ways, they will be similar to the LFO, MFO permits that the Agency of Agriculture currently issue. So.
And I like your sharing of responsibility of both going out. It's really good fix. And does that satisfy the EPA?
If the Agency of Agriculture, the Agency of Natural Resources has primacy in those inspections, we're making the determinations as to whether or not it's point source, non-point source, those sorts of determinations. because those fall under our delegated Clean Water Act authority, EPA needs to feel comfortable that ANR is the one making those determinations on those joint inspections.
Yes, so I just want to bring up another issue, it has nothing to do with this, but it does have to do with water quality. And I believe, Madam Secretary, was brought up in Senate Natural Resources as well, 3-acre rule. I know there were about 700 listed properties that fell under that order. I'm wondering, and I think the question was already asked, so forgive me if you've already answered it. How many of those 700 have registered? How much money is there to help folks? I'm specifically thinking about things like the Rutland State or the Vermont State Fair in Rutland, where from what I understand, there's now an added problem that the brook that runs through it's been classified as impaired, which adds angst to the whole thing. But they're looking at about $1 million in order to just sort of get started. And I don't think we have the people to do it. I don't think there's engineers out there with enough time to do it. So I'll just put it on your radar. You don't need to actually give me an answer, but I think it's important that there are a lot of eyes looking at that particular situation, and it's not going to be very easy to fix.
Yeah, I think you're like, Pete and I are probably two of the people best able to help answer those questions. And so maybe I'll start and let Pete speak to some of the specifics. Certainly, we've heard concerns around the 3-acre stormwater program. You're correct. There's about 700 sites between the Champlain and Memphremagog basins that need to be retrofit. I think it's important to not lose sight of getting those reductions is essential to meeting our larger water quality obligations in Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog. So put another way, appreciating the complexities that swirl around the 3-acre program. If we don't achieve those reductions there, we're gonna have to find them somewhere else, which could be farms. I don't think more pounds exist in our wastewater treatment facilities, so it would be looking at other types of stormwater permits potentially. There was we created last session following some conversations. I don't know if you were involved in them, Senator Colmore, with Senator Bray and Senator Starr around specific to agricultural, and Senator Engel, specific to agricultural operations. It was my understanding at the time that I think there are 4 farm and field days sites that are subject to 3-acre: Orleans, Addison, Rutland, and Champlain Valley.
Yep.
We created a carve out from some of the ARPA funds, and those dollars have been moved over to the Agency of Agriculture. We tried to pull enough or set aside enough funding to cover 75% of the costs, which felt like it was roughly appropriate. The governor has been clear with us that he wants every property owner to have skin in the game in all of these, whether it's investments we're making in manufactured housing communities, investments in CSOs. He's been very clear. He doesn't want the state to provide 100%, but to provide enough that it makes it feasible for whoever the project owner is to fulfill the rest. I don't know the status of those grants, and I know that that's outside your shop, Pete. I think that's in Neil's shop, but you may know the number of applicants in some of those pieces.
Not off the top of my head. I can certainly get that number provided to the committee though.
But I think the understanding has been at least a couple hundred of those 700 sites have applied at this point and begun to implement. We did have significant funding through ARPA available. And then we've also been able to access funding through the Lake Champlain Basin Program, and have provided broad support to folks who need to do engineering assessment to figure out what it would take to comply, and then provided implementation grants to manufactured housing communities and schools at this point, sort of targeting them, knowing that they would have the most challenging financial position to comply.
Thank you.
One last, and if this is a broader discussion, we'll just do it later. Why is there so much emphasis on the waters that are heading north and west and not east into the Connecticut River? What's the designation? We just haven't got there yet?
There's a separate designation. We have 3 large watershed TMDLs or correction plans, as Secretary Moore mentioned. Most of the west half of the state flows into Champlain. So that TMDL or that correction plan that EPA actually developed in concert with us, it calls for reductions across all sectors, across forest roads, across agriculture, across developed surfaces, wastewater, farms. So there are reductions necessary in all of those sectors. In a similar way, Lake Memphremagog flowing to the north, that also has challenges, very similar to Champlain, but lesser. And we have a TMDL there as well.
Right.
And then on the eastern half of the state, we're involved in a multi-state TMDL because the eastern half of Vermont flows to the Connecticut River watershed, which winds up in Long Island Sound, which seems like a long ways away, but all of the states that drain to Long Island Sound contribute to an anoxic zone, or a zone with zero oxygen, as a result of nitrogen pollution. So it's a different focus. Again, agriculture is involved in certain ways, mainly buffers. We put a cap on the wastewater treatment facilities and the nitrogen load flowing in that direction. We're very distant from Long Island Sound, and there's also an atmospheric escape route for nitrogen, unlike phosphorus.
Okay.
So it does evolve and attenuate as it heads down to.
So different pollutant with
pollutant,
different actions.
TMDL. Yes,
Okay.
correct.
Committee,
Also,
everybody good?
thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank
We are a
you.
young committee. This is very, very helpful with us, and we appreciate it very much. You guys got through a lot of difficult stuff and was able to get it, so we, I think, understood it very well.
Excellent. Well, happy to be here. Encourage you, if you're so inclined to hear about the Clean Water Performance Report. I think it would also provide additional context.
I think we would be
And
interested in
we can
that.
talk specifically about some of the work that's been done in the agricultural sector, which at this point is really the lion's share of the phosphorus reductions we're able to document.
Thank you. Thank
you all.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're good.
Yeah.